This is turn 36 of I equipped my heavy crossbow. So we finished our research in Conjuration. We got it all the way up to Conjuration 6, which is where we can start summoning up our tomb oracles, and we have finally started down Alteration. This is going to be important because it brings buffs for our tomb oracles. So we've got our Iron Skin here in Alteration 3, and then Temper Flesh here in Alteration 4, and then way down here in Alteration 6, we're eventually going to get Soul Vortex, which is going to be pretty great. That's going to restore both health and fatigue when the Tomb Oracle SCs are surrounded by living units. But let's go ahead and look back at the messages for now. So Pythian has begun their attack against us. They didn't attack very many provinces at once, so this is one little group here, which is just a small group of Pythian infantry. And then this here is a much larger group with 30 of his Tri-Blessed Sacreds. Arcocephaly reclaimed a couple provinces from Indies, or tried to rather. It looks like he didn't quite manage to do that here. This one he brought more than enough. I think that the reason that he failed here was that his hoplites have a morale penalty because they're being led by a mystic, so they're so even with their experience bonus and friendly dominion bonus, their morale is only 12, which is still okay, but not particularly exceptional. So he's casting Body, Ethereal, and Luck on his hoplites. Body, Ethereal, and Luck are basically going to help them survive against the elementals, which are trampling them. With their trample, even though they're only size 4, they're doing a fair amount of armor-piercing damage, which means that these 18 protection hoplites can still get crushed. Between the Body, Ethereal, and Luck buffs, they actually had a fair chance of surviving each of the trample attempts. However, because there are going to be, a fair number of those trample attempts per round, even though they were able to chop down a significant number of the elementals, they did eventually rout. Let's look at... here we go. So we claimed this province from Man. It was totally unprotected, and we're going to transfer our additional Ichthyeids up to here to help siege the castle. Fertility Cult event. So this is going to basically keep reducing my dominion in this province until I patrol it out or preach it out. This is a province that we had been expecting, just a Triton, or an event that we had been expecting. It's just a Triton attack. That's why I had left these Tritons here, and a fair number of them even managed to survive. Here we got a handful of free gems, so that's great with our misfortune drain. And here we have some barbarians potentially attacking. I don't think that I particularly care about this because I can always reclaim the province if anything bad happens. And I have other things to spend my gold on now that I have to worry about fighting Pythian. So, for starters, we have this scary-looking death ball of Hydras here. So in order to fight against it, I'm going to be deploying fire elementals. So this is why we rushed for Conjuration 5. Most of the mages here are just going to be researching, so yeah, it's a little hard to tell who all is actually going to show up. But essentially what I'm doing is I'm just creating a little ball of mages here on the flanks of the province defense, and I'm having them summon up full-size fire elementals, and then I'm putting some Chthonian reanimators even further on the flanks in order to basically create a skeleton wall in order to prevent a broad front of Hydras from getting around the province defense and around the summoned fire elementals and potentially getting the mages. So I'm grouping up all of my F2 random guys here, and then I'm bringing over one F3 guy as well, or an F2 guy with a skull of flame, flame skull. And then I'm also going to make my first Tomb Oracle. So with those guys, when you're making your SCs, I like to create my gear on the same turn whenever possible, so that way I can float the remainder of my gems. So the core item for pretty much any super combatant is going to be a Vine Shield. That causes all enemies attacking the combatant to take a magic resistance check or become entangled. That's very important for reducing the number of attacks that the combatant is getting. I'm forging for the helmet a horror helmet, so that's going to give it an additional fear aura, which is further increased by the Tomb Oracle's death magic. I'm using my first Sorcerer of the Sands here to forge a Bright Mail Haubergen. So the idea with this is that it's going to add awe, which is another layer of mitigation. So in addition to the protection and defense and so on, all attackers are going to have to make a morale check in order to do damage at all. So similar to what we saw with the Ghost King's awe, I'll be able to have that on my 2 oracles as well. And then for the weapon, I think I'm just making a firebrand. Yeah. I don't remember where exactly I'm making it. It's probably over here somewhere. Yes. So I'm making a... I'm also making Bracer of Protection. I think... oh, I'm making multiple sets of stuff. Okay. And then for the foot slot, I'm giving him Boots of Quickness. So that's going to increase the number of attacks that they get in a round. And it's also going to increase their attack and defense score by a fair bit. That's what I'm doing over here. These guys here can't really raid. There's just not enough, like, I didn't put gems on these guys. I'd actually even move these guys up only to serve as, just to suicide them. This guy's got dementia, so his research is halved, and I don't feel like paying full upkeep for that. And this guy is totally feeble-minded, so he can't research at all. So I was trying to get rid of these mages, which is why they're out there doing the fighting thing. Here, I'm bringing basically just a bunch of Horde of Skeletons casters and a Fire Elemental, so that plus the PD here, which includes a fair number of crossbows and some heavy cavalry, I hope should be enough to actually take on this group of infantry, just in case Pythian attacks me there. Here, I am moving over some actual units, so I have my flanking Cold Aura Undead, and then a bunch of Sacreds here at the front, and a Chthonian Necromancer in order to bless them up. Additionally, I have 2 Earth Random Alchemists, and these guys are similarly going to be casting a bunch of buffs. So I imagine that my buffed up melee units supported by a couple Water Elementals here on the side should have no problem taking on this block of infantry. Here, I'm actually not going to be deploying this army up over here, because I believe that he's going to move his Hydras up, and I don't yet have enough Fire Elementals to actually take on that group of Hydras, I don't think. So depending on what he ends up doing with these guys, because most of the firepower here comes from these crossbows, I just don't think that I have enough damage to beat them yet. Similarly, these guys here would add a little bit, so I'm considering collapsing in on this here when I get what I feel to be sufficient mage support. In the meantime, over here on Pythian's flank, I'm launching a couple of small raiding parties. So this guy's going to make 1 Water Elemental just to add a little bit more damage in case a couple Hydras or an unexpectedly large amount of PD shows up. And this guy's just going to be spamming Skeletons. I'm using the free Shades and Shadow Soldiers that I got from the site there in order to basically serve as a front line, and the Skeletons should theoretically be doing the actual killing. Then over here, I'm bringing yet more Fire Elemental summons and a small group of Sacreds. And between all of these guys, I figure that they should be able to take the province unless he moves the Hydras over here. But given that he took this province with regular infantry, I don't expect him to do that. Meanwhile, I'm going to be gathering up my troops over here with the Ictiids in order to raid this coast here from Pythian. And from my scouting, I can see that the group of crossbowmen that he had over here just disappeared, so I think they were actually here in the south, just disappeared. So expect that he's moving them north, and I'm eventually going to need to fight that large group of crossbows. So yeah, and then Man is still being sieged. As I mentioned, I was able to take this province without any trouble. He didn't even bother putting PD there because he just doesn't have the gold for it, I would imagine. So I'm going to move the Ictiids up to help siege down that castle, and then I'm going to storm it as soon as possible in order to free up these troops. And that's the turn. This is turn 37 of Ekwipt my heavy crossbow. So I took the Throne of Flames because I finally managed to move that scout all the way over there. Do a bunch of site searching, and I even find one F-gem site here, the Tar Pits. I'm summoning 2 Tomb Oracles, and I built a fair amount of gear for them, so I'll be able to start deploying those as well. And we have a couple battles. So first, this raiding party here. This is only taking on a small amount of province defense. There's not a lot that's particularly worth noting here. The ethereal guys here with the steel strength attack actually deal damage, even if it is MR negates, whereas these guys here just paralyze. And it turns out I didn't even really need this elemental. The ethereal units were more than enough in order to actually take on the province defense. So that was that fight, and I'm just raiding with a cheap party there. Here, he actually takes a group of Hydras underwater, so this is going to be annoying. I'm definitely going to need magic in order to take these guys on, because my dinky little underwater units here just aren't going to do the job. I hired this mercenary party, or actually hired all the mercenary parties, one of which is an underwater party called the Wet Ones. So these are just a bunch of these Wet Ones. A fair amount of HP and a little bit of protection from their shark skin gear, but very poor weaponry and very low combat stats. I'm going to be splitting up my parties right over here. So these are the Ichthyids, which are actual troops. And then this is the mercenary party right over here. A small group of my guys here, the Tritons, are going to try to retake this province. I don't mind if the Tritons die, but if they do take it, then, that would be cool. I have a lot of province defense here from an event. So I'm also going to be moving my mages here, but they're just set to retreat. I don't expect my province defense to be enough to actually take on a bunch of sacreds. Here, I'm going to be moving over this mage right over here across the thawed river. I don't expect him to leave those hydras here, so he'll be fighting only province defense, and then he's just going to be summoning some elementals. Here, Pythian didn't move this army at all, so I'm going to reinforce this army further with yet more guys, just to make sure that I would have no problem taking this on. And then here I'm going to move over my entire army. So when fighting these Tri-Blessed Hydras, I have a lot of these guys here who just probably won't help very much, but I'm still going to try to use them anyways. Most of their attacks just aren't going to work because of the Air Bless on the Hydras, but they can still potentially do a bit of damage. Instead, I'm going to be relying on my sacred units to do most of the killing, and of course some fire elementals. I'm casting flaming arrows just in case on my crossbows, so that those attacks that do land are going to be dealing some additional fire damage. I am of course making some elementals, both fire and water, in order to do some more killing. I gave this guy a Staff of Corrosion, so that's going to fire Acid Bolt. It deals a fair amount of armor-piercing damage. Because it's an AoE effect, it is not affected by the air shield. And in addition, it's going to rust equipment, so if I'm fighting Pythian's heavy infantry, it can potentially destroy their armor, making them even more vulnerable to crossbow bolts and the actual melee attacks from my units. In addition, I'm going to be casting Maws of the Earth on one of these guys. The reason that I'm casting it so late in the script is that Maws of the Earth is relatively short range, and I want it to be cast when the Hydras are a little bit closer, just in order to make sure that they hit. Maws of the Earth sets any hit unit's defense to 0, and it also deals a fair amount of armor-piercing damage, and of course it hits in a very large area of effect. So by putting him up here and waiting to cast it, I can potentially cast it after the Hydras have already come in, so that they're not going to be able to attack back when my troops are surrounding them and hitting them. So between that, the Fire Elemental flankers, and my Undead flankers here, I figure that I have a decent shot of, if not actually killing this Hydra army, at least doing a fair amount of damage to it. Over here, I am sending out my first, or one of my first Tomb Oracle SCs. So this guy here is using Shademail Haubergeon. I don't know how to pronounce this. But anyways, in addition to the Bless, he also has a Ring of Regeneration. So with my N9 Bless, after he blesses himself, he's going to have 20% regeneration. He's going to have a fair amount of Fear, because he gets 5 from the helmet, and 3 more from his death magic. His Firebrand is going to give him an area of effect attack, and this is a fair amount of armor-piercing fire damage, so Hydras are going to be especially vulnerable to it, but he should still be able to be fairly lethal against human infantry as well. His Boots of Quickness is going to increase his defense further, along with his Braces of Protection. So he's going to have very high defense. 16, or any attack that rolls 16 or lower is not going to hit him at all. And even those that do hit him are going to have to pass the shield parry of an additional 5 in order to actually avoid that additional 13 protection. So he's going to be very hard to hit and kill. And yeah, between his Fear Aura and his area of effect attack, he should have no problem cleaving through a large number of infantry. Looking at the other battles here, So Ulm fought Jomon and lost, so this time Jomon actually did manage to use his mages without having the elementals get stuck behind things, one can presume. Ulm has no mage support at all in this army. Jomon's mage support is fairly limited. It's just limited to his 2 Dai Tengu, it seems. And the 1 nature mage that comes with the province defense. So he's got a lot of province defense here, potentially even overloading on it. So the crossbows here are shooting at the arrows. They seem to be set to fire arrow. He is summoning 1 air elemental at least. So these are full size. Yeah, he summons 2 more. So now he's got these size 6 tramplers, and what looks like a bunch of Tengu just jumping in. While these guys are sacred, I don't think the Jomon brought any sort of bless, so he hasn't even bothered casting that. However, even without a bless, they have fairly high defense, so they're able to avoid most of the attacks. But as you can see, they're also quite squishy. So with 13 base hit points and fairly low protection with just a leather cuirass, they get hit by melee relatively, or when they do get hit by melee, they die relatively easily. Luckily for Jomon, he's not... Yeah, so he's just not fighting a force that was really geared to take on this amount of PD at all. I think he definitely wasn't expecting all these Tengu there as well. So he took pretty much complete losses here. Because these guys are flyers, they are able to completely surround the army and prevent any of the rangers from escaping. He did take a couple losses, and these guys are relatively expensive in terms of gems. So that kind of sucks for Jomon, but he definitely won the battle, and he's most likely going to be able to re-siege that fort with that Tengu army. Here, my Chthonian alchemist successfully killed himself. This is one of those guys that was, that I was trying to get rid of. He's totally feeble-minded, totally useless, and I just have him walk into the infantry to die, so I don't have to keep paying his pension. Here, Archocephaly just retakes that province that his hoplites failed to capture with a bunch of earth element, or with a bunch of ore elephants, so no trouble there. Here, my guy was set to retreat, so yeah, he just runs away when the big blob of Hydras comes at him. And then here we finally have an actual battle, and you can see the effectiveness of my fire elemental setup. So remember, very scary Hydras here with this amazing Tribless. He also has Dark Vision from the Throne of Darkness, but the important part here is that the air shield means that crossbows are going to be way less effective. The high protection means that with the relatively decent base natural protection, they actually become fairly well armored, and of course they are regenerating 20% of their very high HP pool. So you can kind of see here that everything starts clustering towards the center. This is because everything's just trying to track towards the closest enemy, or rather all the summons are. So the province defense is going to get there first because they were already out at the start of the battle and were starting to run forward already. The hordes of skeletons are running over here up the sides. Pythian didn't actually put his sacreds into a very broad front. He probably wanted to keep them clustered because he doesn't have Divine Blessing for them. So everything's going to be fighting around the middle here, which means that some of my guys are going to get burnt up, and you can kind of see that here, that one of these skeletons already got set on fire. So you can see here that there's that poison aura from the Hydras that's already starting to hurt these humans, but luckily for me, my skeletons and fire elementals are both very poison resistant, so they're not going to be worried about those auras at all. So my regular guys are already able to do a bit of work. They chop up this Hydra here, which is a little bit further forward, and they kill one of the mini Hydras. But they're not going to be killing all that many of them, because as you can see, it takes them more than a round to kill even one, and it's able to regenerate a fair amount of that. This one wasn't even blessed, it doesn't look like, so, yeah. Even the unblessed Hydra is able to survive a great deal of punishment, so he already survived one round, and as you can see, with the blessing, they're generating 18 HP. However, the Fire Elemental, because of the fire vulnerability, is dealing a huge amount of damage. So you can see this guy here already takes 30 from just that first hit. Additionally, because the Fire Elementals have an area of effect attack, they're able to hit 2 of the Hydra hatchlings at once. In this case, they each just killed one of them. And the ones... So, yeah, basically the Hydras and the Banishment spam were able to chew through the hordes of skeletons and the province defense without any trouble. But once the Fire Elementals got into the fight, it's a totally different story. These Fire Elementals are more than enough to take on a Triblessed Hydra on their own. So, yeah, definitely a Fire Elemental favored matchup. They're able to kill one of the Hydras as they're escaping, but most of them do get away because the Fire Elementals are not particularly fast at only 12 move, or 13 move, so yeah. And you can see that here, that while it was a total victory, 4 of the Hydras and 4 of the hatchlings were able to escape. So I did have to spend a fair amount of gems in that fight. I think that was, what was it, like 15 minus 1, so it was like 14 fire gems there. Definitely a very expensive battle, but well worth it. These Hydras are incredibly expensive for Pythian, and I was able to hold on to this fortress as well. And then here, my blind fighters pushed through, and then here his little infantry group basically ran right past this squad right over here. My Tomb Oracle here is going to try to break siege, so there's only 4 huge Hydras left, plus whatever he wants to reinforce with from Ivermark. This guy should be pretty much immune to the Hydras, so they can't hurt him at all. The one thing that they can do to him is frighten him away, because he doesn't have 30 morale. My raiding party here is going to try to double back to take on the human the human infantry squad over here. If he tries to go to either of these forts, they are patrolling with a bunch of skeleton spammers, and then here we're patrolling with some earth elementals. So either way, his army should get defeated. And then if they wait up here, then he's going to be fighting a couple crossbows, some more horde of skeleton spammers, and some fire elementals. And this group over here is going to be reinforced with many of my fire elemental spamming mages. I believe that since he was defeated on this castle, I don't expect him to try again, even though in this case that would be the correct choice if he wants to raid further into my territory. And then over here, I'm going to be moving over a small number of fire elementals as well. So you can see here I basically just burned through pretty much all of my gems between the gear and all of the gems that I'm giving to my mages. But spending gems to win fights is definitely worthwhile. And then, yeah, so we can see that Pythian is a believer in the Death Ball, so that's a big mistake on his part, because what you would want to be doing in most circumstances is splitting up those sacreds into relatively small parties so that he can cover more provinces at once, and then trying to push further into my territory. And you can see that I'm sort of responding to that, or I'm sort of responding to the threat of his doing that by splitting up my coverage here, so that pretty much every province along this arc is going to have some fire elemental summoners in them in order to deal with the Hydras if he sends them forward. And yeah, so this is basically an example of magic beating out sacreds, and given that we are deep into the mid-game at this point, that is definitely to be expected. he's going to need magic of his own in order to beat these SCs, and he is definitely going to be seeing them one way or another in the next turn.